delegation from Ukraine is in Florida for fresh talks with Trump administration officials. They're trying to move ahead with a U.S.-backed proposal to end the war in Ukraine. Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke just moments ago as talks wrapped up.
Much work remains, but today was again a very productive and useful session where I think additional progress was made. And we continue to be realistic about how difficult this is, but optimistic, particularly given the fact that as we've made progress, I think there is a shared vision here that this is not just about ending the war, which is very important. It is about securing Ukraine's future.
Now, after meetings in Geneva last weekend, substantial changes were made to the original 28-point plan. Russia hasn't agreed to any plan, we should mention, and major sticking points remain from both Ukraine and its European allies. But let's bring in CNN senior White House correspondent Kristen Holmes, who's with us. Kristen, what else did we hear from the Secretary of State here?
Well, Omar, it was a really short press conference. He said he had time constraints. He basically reiterated that he was very optimistic. But as you heard there, he sounded a lot more realistic than what we had been hearing from the White House, in particular noting, again, that Russia has not signed off to anything and that these agreements or these negotiations between the U.S. and Ukraine is just a starting point. Take a listen.
This is comprehensive, what we're working on here today. It's not just about the terms that ends fighting. It's about also the terms that set up Ukraine for long-term prosperity. I thought we started laying the groundwork for that, most certainly in Geneva. I think we continued that work in our communications throughout the week. I think we built on that again today, but there's more work to be done. This is delicate, it's complicated, there are a lot of moving parts, and obviously there's another party involved here that'll have to be a part of the equation, and that'll continue later this week when Mr. Witkoff travels to Moscow.
Of course, that other party he's talking about is Russia. And as we have discussed, we have heard from the White House in the past where they have felt optimistic only to have Russia back out or Putin to essentially pull the rug out from underneath them. We all remember that sit down between Putin and Trump in which Trump sounded incredibly optimistic coming out of it. He brought all the European leaders to the White House and then nothing for months. So there are still a lot of questions to be had. And what was interesting about listening to this very brief press conference is that no details were given, no real details substantially about what was being ironed out. Of course, we know that two of the biggest sticking points are still those security guarantees, wanting Ukraine and our European allies wanting to make sure that this doesn't happen again, that Russia doesn't invade Ukraine or any of those surrounding territories again, but also territory and ceding territory. Will Ukraine have to actually give up land? Most individuals, most people who are privy to these conversations do believe that some land is going to have to be ceded to Russia, but just how much land, that is a big question. We've heard a lot of back and forth on this. And we know actually the conversation about this got tense at the last White House meeting that President Trump had with Zelensky when Trump was trying to tell him that he was going to have to cede land, and Zelensky essentially saying that wasn't going to happen. So still a lot of questions here. As you heard Rubio say there, Witkoff is going to be meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin later in the week in Moscow. One thing to remember is that President Trump himself says he doesn't want to meet with Zelensky or with Putin again until there is a done deal.
Yeah, Kristen, Witkoff, as you mentioned, and as we heard from Secretary of State, expected to head to Russia for this meeting. But can you just give us a sense for why maybe this effort of a meeting for the Russian president is different than previous efforts? Maybe it's not, and we still haven't made substantial progress. But how is this potential meeting or this future meeting being viewed here?
Well, a couple of things. One is that they're going to the president of Russia with an actual plan. So that's different than what we've seen before. I mean, I will remind you again, this meeting between Putin and Trump in Alaska, nobody had a plan. It was just that Trump said he wanted to see the end of the war. They sat down, they talked face to face. A lot of that was just Trump wanting to try to get a read on the Russian president. And of course, as we know, it didn't go anywhere. Then there was this whole conversation about Putin meeting again with President Trump, which Trump himself scrapped because he learned from his associates, from his advisors, that Putin wasn't ready to move in the same direction that the White House wanted to move in, which was an end to the war in Ukraine, or at least the White House didn't believe that. So what you're seeing now is this idea that there is a plan floating around. We know the Russians have been briefed on the initial plan. They've likely been briefed in between as well, because we know that the White House is in constant contact with Russia, as well as some of the counterparts, some of the actual intermediaries that go between the U.S. and Russia. So it's likely they have an idea of what's going to be in this plan. But what you're seeing now is them hammering out the details with Ukraine, and you heard from both sides. There's a tough discussion going on here, which likely means they're telling Ukraine, you're going to have to cede some of this stuff if we want to actually get a deal. So what makes this different is that he's going to go in with likely a document that is the proposal for this peace plan that the U.S. wants, that the U.S. is going to be hammering home, and that the U.S. has just come out of these huge negotiations with Ukraine on. What doesn't make this difference is we still don't know how Putin is going to react, particularly to any changes that were made from the original proposal.
Yeah. Kristen Holmes, appreciate the reporting as always. Let's continue this conversation with Jill Doherty, a CNN contributor and author of the book, My Russia, What I Saw Inside the Kremlin. Now, Jill, we heard from both sides today, U.S. and Ukrainian sides, that progress is being made. But at least in portions of the plan that had either crept out before, there were proposals potentially to cut off Ukraine's ability to join NATO, which of course is a big sticking point for Russia, potential ceding of land as well. I just wonder, are there any obvious places to you that you believe U.S. negotiators would start to ask of Ukraine at this point?
Well, I think the main thing that they have to talk about is territory.
Yeah.
Because if you look at both sides, Russia is saying essentially, the areas that we have tried to get but have not been able to, we want those. And that means essentially a lot of it, Crimea, basically, that was taken in 2014 illegally, but we're talking about Donbass, where there has been a lot of fighting. So the Russians are saying they were not able to get all of it, but they want those areas and maybe even legally accepted as legally part of Russia by the West and by the United States, and that the Ukrainians would have to pull out of those areas. So these are, when you talk about details, this is really very detailed, and it is very difficult to think that they can come together. Putin is really taking, I would call it, a brick wall strategy. He is saying it's my way or the highway, and he is insisting on the plan essentially that he's had since the beginning. But he is really, if you look at even the tone and the words he's using now, he is really set on saying, I'm not going to make any compromises. It's the Ukrainians who have to. So I think it's good, to hear Secretary Rubio, who does know these issues, talking about the things that obviously the Ukrainians want to hear, sovereignty of Ukraine and security. But when you get to Moscow, that will be chapter 2, when Putin gets into the weeds and says, this has to be defined, et cetera, as he always does.
So, I guess at this point, the question is we've had a lot of stops and goes really at various points of these potential peace talks. And I just wonder, how would you contextualize this moment and maybe any added significance it has versus other moments where it seemed as though Ukrainian peacemakers and Russian peacemakers might come to something, but then in the end, nothing ends up coming out of it. Strikes continue and the war goes on.
Yeah, I think if you look at Ukraine right now, look at President Zelensky. He is under enormous strain at this point. And I think that is somewhat different from before. Obviously, they've been under attack, but you have him militarily. Russians are very slowly, but they are moving inexorably forward. Then you have the political situation, which is this corruption scandal that has unfolded inside of Ukraine, which actually led to his chief person stepping down, as we know, Mr. Yermak. And he's under pressure, at least it appears, from the American president, who gave him a deadline. That deadline is gone. Thanksgiving is over. But he's under pressure from the United States to do a deal as well. So all of these factors at that time. And, Putin is under some pressure, too. He knows that his economy is being hit by sanctions, and his military, they are moving ahead, but they are having problems too. That's why they have North Koreans and, the Chinese and the Iranians helping them. So I think the timing, the feeling that this has to get wrapped up, but when and how is the question. But I think this really is, it feels like a turning point. But Omar, I know what you're saying. We have felt this way many times, and then it just kind of dissolves and we're back to the original situation.
Look, optimism is a very priceless currency these days, Jill Doherty, but of course, reality has to catch up. We will see what happens moving forward. Appreciate the time and insight.
Thank you.
Been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the they're doing.